Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Today, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Linda Bramble, one of CCOVI's professional affiliates, to the big screen today. Linda is a wine writer, author, and educator, and friend to many of us, probably all of us here in the room and those online. Welcome to those online, by the way. Linda is a firm believer in that anyone who can taste, smell, and has the interest can become a connoisseur of wine, fine wine. And for all of her efforts, she's widely recognized in the industry for her contributions to Ontario wines. Linda graduated with her PhD in philosophy and education from the University of Buffalo and has worked as a Brock faculty member in both leadership studies and wine education, of course. Her book, Niagara's Wine Visionaries, details the story of the leaders who transformed the Niagara wine industry. And if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. But today, she's speaking to us about the influence of wine writers on consumer behavior. And with that, welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you. It's nice to see everybody. Some students, Meg and Tony and Faye and Suzanne and Steve, and Linda. Nice to see you. And Belinda. Belinda and Barb and I formed a group. We are taking ukulele lessons, and we called ourselves the Ukulele Ladies. Anyway, and guests, welcome. So, I'd like to introduce you to this gentleman. His name is Dan Ariely. He's a behavioral economist on the faculties of MIT and Duke. You might be familiar with some of his books. One is called Predictably Irrational. He's got another book called The Truth About Dishonesty. He's also a founder of the Center for Advanced, what was it called? Advanced Hindsight. He studies irrationality. And on his website, he has the following letter from a reader. It says, "Dear Dan, I can't help noticing, why does a behavioral economist have a publicity photo of himself that shows him drinking a glass of wine while smirking? Just wondering, in Greenville, North Carolina, Bob Knight." So our friend Dan writes back, "Dear Bob, for me, wine illustrates several different aspects of irrationality. It is a clear case of something about which we know little, but pretend to know much more. It's an experience that is very sensitive to external influences, type of glass, the cost of the bottle, label, and so on. And it's something for which we are willing to pay more based on the most ludicrous of reasons. Finally, it's a delivery vehicle for alcohol, which causes lots of irrational behavior." And he says, "With all this, you can see why wine is my bread and butter." So the topic of my lecture today is how wine writers influence consumer behavior, with a subtext on the predictably irrational nature of wine writing today. This is Andrew Jefford. He's a very well-established writer in the UK. He writes for Decanter, and he was recently quoted as saying, "The creature we used to call a wine writer has died." Now, as a wine writer myself, I prefer to invoke Mark Twain at this point and say reports of my death and that of my wine writing colleagues has been greatly exaggerated, as I hope to illustrate. So I got to thinking, why would he say something like this? After all, I mean, he's a wine writer. But I thought, well, maybe he's referring to the fact that a lot of us have lost a lot of gigs. You know, with newspapers going out of business, can't get advertising, they drop the first thing, they drop the wine columnist. Magazines, we just saw the death of one of Canada's foremost magazines, and that was Wine access. Very hard to stay in print publishing today. So I thought, well, maybe he was thinking that we've died because there are fewer of us in the market and there's high unemployment. But then I thought, well, no. Those of us who have lost jobs in one media are finding work other ways to keep bread and butter on the table. So then I thought, well, maybe he said we're died because of some unethical behavior. And there has been in the ranks of wine writers. Their most recent case was of a writer who shall go unnamed because that writer is still out there. That writer was demonstrated that writer, I don't want to give the gender away, was plagiarizing. And then there are people that get really annoyed when they learn that some writers are invited on these junkets all over the world and it's all expenses paid, and then they write about the wines that they tasted when they get there. I stopped being invited because I was invited on a couple of these junkets and I didn't like the wines, so I didn't write about them. Well, you know, drop Linda from the list. Then there are those writers who do get paid by wineries to write favorable reviews, and that is unethical. Those people who are members of professional associations get monitored, their behavior gets monitored, and sooner or later they get discovered and get censured in some way. So I thought, well, no, that's not the reason for Andrew Jefford's opinion. Then I started to think, well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that in the past few years there's been a lot of research on the nature of wine writing and wine writing experts. You say that 3 times. Go ahead. Wine writing experts. Demonstrating a concern about the competence of wine experts. So I thought, well, since I'm writing about the influence of wine writers, and I thought, well, maybe I better just double check this. So if the expertise of wine writers was in doubt, then I had to think about this. No perceived expertise, no authority. No authority, no influence. And those of you who are familiar with Robert Cialdini and his work on influence, you'll know just how important the role of authority plays in influence. So I said, well, when did their expertise first come into, under suspicion? Steve Heimoff, who is the West Coast editor for The Wine Enthusiast, recently wrote, for the first time in the long history of wine commentary, dating at least to the 18th century, wine experts have become a suspect class, like sex offenders. So I thought, well, okay, if this is the case, what do we mean by expertise, wine expertise? So I remembered James Chanteau's theory of expert competence. He addresses the question, what factors lead experts to do well or to do poorly? Very interesting. He listed 5 attributes that if you are to claim expertise, you must have these 5 attributes. The first, you could guess what the first one is. What would you think would be the first attribute? Knowledge of the field, right? Knowledge of the field. And he says, yes, that is important, but it is insufficient. It's an insufficient condition because the rest of these things have to come into play. The next is cognitive skills, and by this he means the ability to identify exceptions, to work under stress, to think qualitatively different from novices. The next is psychological skills, the ability to really focus and have the confidence to express yourself and to have those communication skills that, especially in wine, you know, you have that little tip of the tongue notion of what you're tasting, but you can't put your finger on that word. Well, it's up to a wine expert to put his or her finger, to name that. So you have to have communication skills. Now, I agree that some of those skills get a little florid at times, but for the most part, you have to have that skill. The next is decision-making skills. In order to avoid the illusions, the cognitive illusions, the intellectual illusions, the perceptual illusions that we are all victim to, it's important for an expert to use a system of some sort that enables that expert to go through a certain kind of checklist. Well, wine experts do this as well. They have, you go through the appearance of the wine and the aroma of the wine and the palate of the wine and the texture and so on. So it's a pretty methodical way to make decisions. But it was his last attribute that really got me thinking, aha, I bet this is why there has been a question on wine writers and their expertise. And he describes this as the task characteristics of what experts do. And he defined it in terms of two types of classes. One class as a syndrome of factors that will make those experts in that class do well. They have good performance. And then there's another class of task characteristics that defines those people and professions that might do poorly. So he argues that it's the nature of the tasks an expert performs that determines the extent to which his or her expertise is scrutinized and or questioned. So the task characteristics of good performance, well, the stimuli are fairly stable, okay? That the experts in the field agree. They are all seeing that same stimulus. That feedback is immediately available, and they use an objective analysis. And, oh, okay, that was it. So now, who are the experts that are less inclined for their expertise to be questioned? Well, one is accountants, test pilots, grain inspectors, soil judges, astronomers. All right? They are less likely to have their competence questioned. Livestock judges as well. What are the task characteristics of poor performers? All right, you can guess. When the stimuli are changeable, when experts disagree, and we all know that wine experts disagree, when the problems are less predictable, every vintage is a new wine, every bottle is a new wine, when feedback is not immediately available, and when they're using a subjective analysis. Now, the decision-making tool that wine experts use is a system to help go through that decision-making. But make no mistake, it is subjective. Educated, but subjective. So, who falls into this class? Judges, counselors, parole officers, stockbrokers, physicians, auditors, lie detector analysts. What's the one? Ice dancing judges, okay? They each may be very competent to judge on their own, but they are highly scrutinized and highly suspect. So, when was the performance, the expertise of wine writers and wine experts first called into question? Recently, fairly recently. So the first one was in 2001 when Frederick Roche, actually he came here. He has a winery now in the Loire, and his agent lives in Grimsby. And I know his agent is Toby O'Brien. You know Toby? Anyway, he called when I was on the faculty here, and he said, you know what, I've got Frederick Roche here. He's just completed his PhD at the University of Bordeaux. You want him to come and talk to your students? So I said, yeah. So he came and he told us about his research. And here is how his research was reported. And it was reported this way ever since, for the last, 13 years. So what he did was he had 57 experts with 2 different bottles, all right? One bottle was a Bordeaux Supérieur, which is a simpler type of wine, and then the next was a Grand Cru, And so then he compared the tasting notes from the 57 experts that were tasting the wine, and sure enough, the less prestigious wine got the fewer marks and good descriptors, and the Grand Cru was fantastic. Oh, this was just fantastic. They didn't know that it was the same wine. Then another experiment that was part of his PhD was he had two different glasses of wine. One was a white and one was a red. And he asked, again, the experts for their tasting notes. And the notes came back for the white, crisp and fruity and refreshing, sometimes a little too much acid. And then for the right, hearty, full-bodied, notes of cassis and anise and so on. Well, what those experts didn't know was it was the same wine, only it had red food dye into the red wine. Okay, so we are left to conclude that the experts couldn't tell a white from a red or a simple wine from a premium wine. The unfortunate thing was that they weren't experts at all taking part in this study. They were undergraduate students in the enology program. Now, granted, enology students know more than the average consumer, but they were not experts yet. But experts, wine experts, were called, kind of simple-minded, and they couldn't tell a white from a red and a premium. So their expertise was called into question. The next is a spate of studies that I'm going to report, and they each look at how experts taste differently from the average consumers. In my picture, I was thinking of having a little, what do you call it, a cannibal with, I'm sorry, that's terrible, it's terrible. Yeah, it was restrained. Thank you, Steve. But, so these studies explored the claim that experts were different from average consumers. They didn't like the same types of wines. So there are three studies that I'd like to explain here. The first was in 2008 by Jan Schiefer. I never know if I'm pronouncing German correctly. Schiefer? Anyway, and Christiane Fischer. The title of their study was The Gap Between Wine Expert Ratings and Consumer Preferences. And so what they did was they took the results of the German Agricultural Society Wine Awards, and then from the experts tasting. And then they got some average tasters and they put them in a lab, and they had those average tasters taste the same kind of array of wines and judge the wines as well. And then they tried to look for concordance between the experts and the non-experts, and there wasn't any. He said that although there was correspondence between the experts' ratings and those people who had some education, some wine appreciation, experts' ratings may not be so useful as a decision cue for a consumer who wishes to purchase a wine he will like. Because they say awards and ratings hold little value for a large share of the non-expert audience. Okay, they don't like the same types of wines. And then there was the next study. Wine Expertise Predicts Taste Phenotype by John Hayes and Gary Pickering. Hi, Gary. This is our own Gary. And he took a different perspective. He took a psychophysical perspective using PROP. I have a hunch that you're all familiar with what we mean by PROP. Maybe those in the viewing audience don't, but it's P-R-O-P, and you can look it up on the internet, but it just looks at one's taste association with bitterness and makes some judgments. It has nothing to do with flavor, just taste, sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. But anyway, so he used PROP as an organizing principle, and they found that experts were more likely to be medium tasters or super tasters, and average wine consumers were more likely to be average or non-tasters. So they conclude that wine consumers may wish to apply caution in adopting an expert's endorsement or recommendations. Experts taste different from non-experts. The third study also happened in 2008. And these were the wine trials by Robin Goldstein. And this book is available, and I think they update it every year, as a matter of fact. Anyway, what Robin did was he tasted 6,000 wines in blind tastings. Well, he didn't taste them, but he did the statistical analysis and found that when tasting blind, most people preferred the inexpensive wines over to the expensive wines by a good margin. And he concludes that wine experts liked more expensive wines a bit more, but a vast majority of wine drinkers are everyday drinkers. Therefore, expert reviews have little relevance to the average consumer. Okay, the siege continues over the competence and the influence of wine experts as wine writers. Then comes Robert E. Hodgson. At the time that he did this study, he had just retired. He was a statistics, there I did it, professor, and owned a winery in California. And he couldn't figure out why one wine in one competition would win a gold, and then that same wine would get nothing in another competition. So, he said, was it bottle variability? Was it just different opinions of different clusters of wine tasters? Or could the variability be caused by the inability of individual judges to reproduce their scores? So, for 4 years, he got the permission of the folks at the very prestigious California Wine Fair. 4 years, 65 panels. Each panel contained 4 judges. Each judge would taste about 100 wines per day over the course of 2.5 days. You do the math. He had lots and lots of data with which to work. So what he did was, in the course of 3 tastings for each meeting, like over the course of the 4 years, he would have in like 3 flights, like let's say there were, I don't know, let's say a flight of 10 wines, 3 of those wines would be the same wine, okay? And he did this 3 times. What he discovered in his analysis was the difference that one judge would score, let's just for sake of illustration, let's say the judge would score wine number 2, 86. Wine number 5 would be that same wine, but he'd give it a 94. And then the third replicate, he would give a 90. So in other words, they would vary plus or minus 4. So, he then made the conclusion that judges could not replicate their own scores. Oh. Scores varied by plus or minus 4 points over 3 tastings. So when this hit, the popular press, you love to knock a tall poppy down, and so often when you meet a wine expert, they sometimes can be really full of themselves, and so you really like to say, ha ha, you're not so important after all. Well, now the problem with all of these studies is they're highly criticized. Some are exceptionally flawed, but it's not my aim today to explain the flaws in each of these studies. Some was a misinterpretation of the results, like Roche's misinterpretation. They weren't tasters. They weren't expert tasters, rather. But now all wine writers were suspect, like sex offenders. But what's that? I couldn't help myself. I make plans and design these presentations. The die was cast. That's a die. I know, it's a stretch. It's a stretch. But the die was cast. In other words, it was out there. Nobody went back to error check or to see whether or not they didn't go back to the original studies, or they didn't even read the critiques of these studies. They were just that wine experts didn't deserve to have any influence on anybody. They weren't competent. So if the economy was stripping writers of their employment in print publishing, and scientists were stripping them of any shred of trustworthiness or in their legitimacy as being competent advisors in wine, if they didn't have any, if it wasn't that the traditional wine writer had no clothes, he was sure down to his underwear, because it was a pretty slippery slope of confidence. Now, this reputation of wine writers' competence started around the same time that a new generation emerges. And this is the generation of millennials, 1980 to 2000. They're different consumers from their parents and their grandparents, familiar with digital communication, and they have confidence to make up their own minds. They don't check one answer. These are the Google guys. They'll find many answers from many sources. And they like to interact with each other and with authors and so on. This is from one writer from a millennium wine enthusiast, and she expressed what I was reading a lot of people were saying. She writes, I want to know not just the deliciousness of a wine, but why it is culturally valuable. I can just see her saying this. And I do not want one man to tell me what is good. So again, we start to doubt the validity of wine ratings, especially the wine ratings coming from people like Robert Parker or James Laub or any of the big guys that use numbers. How can you rate a wine with one number? A wine is so much more complex. So I mean, that whole critique was generated. But the millennials really didn't care much. They didn't care. They just wanted to have some way of learning and communicating. But it was the perfect setting for revolution. Now, kind of work with me here, because I'm going to explain something that might be a little convoluted. Wine writers were suffering from a legitimation crisis. And what I mean by this, German political philosopher Jürgen Habermas has a theory of legitimation crisis, and he argues that whenever you get more and more people into a field, like into a democracy, and they start to learn what their rulers or their experts are saying, and then they start to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not right. What you're saying and how you're ruling me, how you're governing me, now that I really understand what's going on, you're not so legitimate. After all, we're witnessing this in the Ukraine. So this was one thing that was happening. Another thing was the disruptive innovation of WordPress came on the market. I think you all know what WordPress is, or Blogsport. In other words, it enabled just ordinary folks, not wine experts. If they wanted to have their own blog, that started out as weblog. Did you know that? Weblog? Blog. They could go online. They didn't have to have an editor. They didn't have to have an error checker. They didn't have to have, you only have so many inches that you can write in. They didn't have a deadline. They could just go on and have the freedom to express their points of view. And they didn't have to be experts, because they reasoned, well, if all of these so-called experts don't like what I like, and I'm an average Joe, an average taster, well, I'll speak on behalf of the average tasters. So therefore, I can have my own wine blog. So that's the second thing. The third thing was this receptive new audience, the millennials that didn't care. They don't want one expert. They want to interact. They want to go online. They want to see lots of points of views. So it was a very interesting time in the life of a wine writer. Mike Steinberger, if you haven't read him now, especially the students or any wine enthusiast, please do. He has been described as one of the best wine writers on the planet, and I so agree. Mike Steinberger. Anyway, in a wonderful article that he wrote, The Future of Wine Writing, he said it is time for the vox populi. In other words, empowerment of the people. And there were some people that welcomed it, and then there were many others that did not. We started to witness a wine revolution. In other words, I remember reading Steve Tanzer, who is the wine writer in New York City, very, very well-known wine writer, and he was furious. He said, it's hard to tell, there's so much noise out there. How do the good wine writers surface? Because slowly, as you can imagine, there were a lot of very legitimate wine writers that were also getting into blogs, out of work, or another channel, an alternative channel. So they were getting into blogging as well. So Tanzer wanted to know, how can you separate these two sources of information? Believe it or not, in 1997, a wine blog did not exist. Today there are 1,500 in North America alone. 1,000 are written by non-professionals. They are fast, cheap, no criteria, no editors, no code of ethics, no monitors, but they persist. So, as the wine writers who wanted to differentiate themselves from, what Tanzer calls the noise, they get more, as they enter the medium, they say, we've got to raise the standards. They demanded the standards. So they now have blog awards, and you can go online and you can now see who are complying to the standards that have been developed. They even have blog conferences where they meet to discuss, certain issues that arise and defining codes of ethics and so on. So we're getting a more legitimate and influential source for wine knowledge, wine writing, and so on the internet, and it's free. Wine writing is fragmented. However, as Dr. Liz Thatch writes, she's from Sonoma State. When we had our Bacchus conference, she was down here giving papers, very well-known wine researcher. She writes that blogs are growing because they are viewed as offering objective, community-driven commentaries on wine at a time, when the community of established traditional wine writers can't possibly cover all the fine wine being made. And she's right. I mean, I agree with her on that. But there is a dark side to blogs, so we need to weigh this as well. They are seldom profitable. If you're not making money, you are more subject, not you, or me, of course, but you could be subject to the little, I'll do this for you, you do this for me, because it's very difficult. They're hard to maintain. They can perpetuate myths, and this is the most destructive part, the dark side. They can perpetuate myths or innuendos or falsehoods, and I've read some that are blistering and unfounded diatribes against innocent people. And I've also discovered that the more amateur they are, the more bloated they are with wine reviews that, as some of the students know, that you can really only identify 4 descriptors of a wine, really, legitimately. But you read some of these reviews and they go on and on with mango and the earth and the sea and the sun and the stars. So, how to sort through the good, the bad, and the ugly? Come along, Dr. Kostas Zephyropoulos. it's not so really so hard. It is what it looks like. I understand he was at Ottawa for a while as well. Anyway, he did a statistical analysis. He created a model called the Social Network Analysis Index. And on it, he does an analysis of 4 attributes of a blog. Recognition, is it recognized by many? Activity, does it generate activity with comments and discussions? Does it have novel ideas? Because he argues novel ideas exert more influence. And he also says that it must have a certain eloquence. A blog must be well written to be influential. This is why I do refer you to, well, I have a list. It's coming up. So he now has, in his study, he's listed, after he conducted his, and this was worldwide, but he found that the most influential wine bloggers were in North America. And he lists the following as the most influential. And I'm just going to go over these very quickly because I know it's hard to read those. But fermentation, vinography, good wine under 20, good grape, wannabe wine, Len Thompson, Dr. Vino, maybe you've seen Dr. Vino. Seen Dr. Vino? Jim's Loire, Wild Walla Walla Wine Woman, and Dirty South. Now, it turns out that most of these winning blogs are also written by traditional wine writers. Then in a study that I didn't put here, because I forgot, there was a study done not too long ago by Santos who looked at the influence of the wine blogs in terms of purchasing behavior. And what he found was that although they don't influence as much retail, they influence a lot of online purchasing. So I couldn't help but pick my own Ontario picks of my favorite blogs. Dean Tudor, Wine Align, this is David Lorison and John Szabo. Wines in Niagara, Rick Van Sickle, Tony Espler. Grape Guy Vintages, with Michael Pincus, and Uncork Ontario by Sean McCormick. These are all wonderful, wonderful blogs to explore Ontario wines. Okay, so who influences the buying behavior of the average consumer? Because if we know that the average consumer is not interested in what the expert has to say, who are they turning to? Because you go into a retail store, you have to have some way of making a decision. So how do they do it? Well, a firm in the UK, I believe, yes, the UK, said that the average consumer turns to friends and trusted advisors for advice on how to buy wines. And this was replicated in another study by Pickett. So they turn to friends and advisors. So then I said, who do friends and trusted advisors turn to for guidance? Well, I started to think about this, and I said, well, we do know, there was another study that I should have mentioned just a second ago, another UK study that said 30%, 30% of consumers out there, and these are regular consumers, these are the people that turn to the wine expert for advice, 30% of the market. So here we go. If roughly 30% of regular, these are kind of wine-savvy consumers, still go to traditional wine writers for their information, and if the other 70% go to friends and trusted advisors, it looks like it's the friends and advisors who are still reading traditional wine writers. So if you followed my little convoluted logic there. So the point is, it's the trusted advisors and the friends that are being influenced by wine writers. So this is where we're getting the influence of today's wine writer, not in the everyday market, but in the wine-savvy market. But for those who are interested in crowdsourcing your advice for wine, how many people are familiar with Cellar Tracker? Is that not a great source? Let me tell the rest of you what it's like. Cellar Tracker, and you can't read the bottom there, so I will read it to you. Cellar Tracker is the world's largest collection of wine reviews, tasting notes, and personal stories from people who love wine. Experts and non-experts alike will use this web-based seller management system, and they will turn to it. Right now, there are, as of January, there were 288,000 registered users with 30 million individual bottles of wine with tasting notes, all right, when they were tasted, and tasting notes, and by whom. And that amounts to nearly 3.8 million wine reviews from users. So you put in the wine that you are interested in learning more about, the list comes up of those people who have tasted it and written notes on it, and then you can decide for yourself whether or not this is a wine you want to buy, or maybe it's in your cellar, do you want to open it? I think it's a fantastic system. So, here comes another one of mine. Have traditional wine writers gone? Where? Thank you, Steve! Yes, the way of the dodo bird. Well, the LCBO thinks not. Here's Astrid Brumer, who is the product manager of the Ontario wine category. She writes, I haven't observed any decline in the importance of traditional wine writers. I find that when critical accolades from well-known wine writers are used to promote a wine, it definitely helps spur sales. Then her colleague in media relations, Heather McGregor, she writes, and I contacted them, and this was in emails. She said, speaking on behalf of the two other wine categories, fine wine and spirits, I guess it was. The LCBO uses wine ratings and reviews by both wine writers and product consultants in our vintages catalogs to help customers make educated decisions. So once again, we have the confirmation that wine writers today, today's version of our wine writer, is influencing the more savvy consumer. Think about it, and I may be wrong because I meant to check it out when I went to the liquor store yesterday and I got carried away. You ever see a shelf talker in the general list? You know what I'm saying when I say shelf talker, right? You go into the vintage sections and you see shelf talkers, right? So this is where the LCBO knows, don't bother in the everyday general list category. They're not going to pay attention, but they will pay attention in the vintages section. So scientific evidence of influence is scant, but we do know this. The more wine education, the more concordance with traditional wine writers and experts. Traditional wine writers' reviews still matter for the segment of the experienced consumer. However, wine writing and wine buying are still, I have a knot in there, don't look at that knot, they are still very perverse. This was a study done by Tracking Media Usage and the Influence of Critics, done in 2002 by a California market research company. And they came up with the following: 87% of their respondents agreed with the statement, I trust my own taste more than I do the wine critics. 87%. Then, in a little contradictory bit of irony, they also report that 49% agreed with the statement, I try hard to avoid wines with poor ratings. Think about it. And I say that's something Dan Ariely can butter his bread on. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd certainly be happy to address them. I also want a special thanks to Dean Tudor, the Wine Writers Circle, and Debbie Pratt, Public Relations from VinCor. I passed some ideas by them, and they said, yeah, you're safe. Now, Belinda. Yeah, you know what? No! But, I was going to. This was when I left Brock, when was it, 2005? Has it been that long since I've retired? And I'm not really retired, but nevertheless, I was going to do it then, and I have a website, and then it was so bloody hard to keep up, so I didn't. But my website is actually WordPress. So yeah, after I did all this, I said, yeah, I think I'm going to go back online and have a blog. So yes, not now, but give me a month or so. Yes, another question. No? Okay.
First, I just wanted to thank you for your honest approach to what appears to be a delicate, or could be a delicate subject. So thank you for that. My question goes back to Frederick Roche. Was it ever revealed officially that his that the folks that he had as quote experts were actually enology students? Was it ever revealed?
Yeah. Well, officially, I'm not sure what is official and what is unofficial. If you go on the web and just say critiquing Frederick Roche's study, or just Frederick Roche, there are people who are aware of it, but it's only the people who will go back, who have gone back to the original study. And if you don't, because it's replicated in a wonderful book called by Harold Bloom on the origins of pleasure. He writes about it, and that's a fabulous book, by the way. But again, he replicates the same. Any place that, or any time they can say we are all subject to our perceptions can follow us up. Look what can happen to even experts. They'll write about that. Jonah Lehrer, in his book on creativity, has it in there. But then again, he was accused of plagiarizing. But anyway, that is in his book. So if you go back to the original study, yes, and that original study is online. And then there are other critiques, but they're not popular. They're not popular. So the myth gets perpetuated.
And also with you mentioned about the Wine Blog Awards.
Yeah.
Are most of the winners, and you might have said this in your, and I'm sorry if you did, but are most of the winners of these Wine Blog Awards traditional wine writers, or are they bloggers from the average taster?
Yeah, good question. Most have been former wine writers or wine writers who are still writing. Like you look at Jefford or Tony Aspler, they are writing in print as well as having blogs. Then there are some newcomers as well, and particularly the one that I pointed out, Sean McCormick. He is not a wine expert, but he certainly has done an awful lot for the wine industry. So I think as more and more people are aware of what the standards are, and you can check that out, to check the standards. If you look up wine blogs, you'll see what the standards are. More people are inclined to want to elevate their work as well. Meg?
What are the requirements to be a wine writer?
What are the requirements to be
a test or?
Yeah, what are the requirements to be a wine writer? The more influential wine writers are members of the wine writers circle. And in order to get into the wine writers circle, you have to meet certain criteria. One is you have to be published by a legitimate organization. Now we have new associates that are entering as members, but they're not like voting members, and they are bloggers. But then their work gets submitted to all the members of the Wine Writers Circle, and then that's judged as well. There really are no criteria. If you want to hang up a shingle and call yourself a wine writer, you can. You can. But then again, as Debbie Pratt was telling me, everybody knows in the industry who has the expertise and who doesn't. So how does a wine writer get expertise? Many of them will take the W set, or in other words, many will become sommeliers. They will get wine education, so that when somebody questions, who are you to tell me what I should think about wine, or even pay attention to what you taste? Then they have something that can guarantee that they have met certain requirements of background.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, as a consumer, if you're making a decision, based on a wine writer, how would you know if they were legitimate or not? And if there was a question of 2/3 of the blogs, wine blogs on the internet not being by actual wine writers, then almost like when you buy food, if it said it was certified organic, you know that it's really organic because it has that kind of stamp on it. If there was an equal thing to wine writing that would prove that that person was actually legitimate and had done certain requirements to be able to make the statements that they were making.
Yeah, the short answer is you can't, there is really no kind of recognized credential that everybody must comply. This is why it's also part of that task characteristic of that expert and that, you know, in Chanteau's frame of reference. Experience in that case, and just going on the internet and saying, well, no, who is Dr. Vino? Who is Tom Wark? Who is Tony Aspler? And they will have their credentials on file. And then the other part of this is to try them out. Let's say, who is Josh Reynolds? Like, I don't even know who Josh Reynolds is, and I see his scores all the time in vintages. I don't know who he is. I should look him up. But so you buy a bottle and you say, I like this. That's Josh Reynolds did that. Okay, I guess his palate is similar to mine. At the end of the day, you're not going to be taken off in some wild, exuberant kind of chase. Did I answer? Okay, good. Yes?
What do you think about like celebrities like promoting their own wine? Like for example, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie have their own wine. What do you think about that?
What do I think about celebrities promoting their own wines?
Yeah.
All the more power to them, you know. They're using their celebrity to sell something. What's his name? The guy with the salad, Paul Newman, did the same thing. What do I think about it? What do you think about it?
I'd be like more popular or more like people buy it.
Of course.
But it doesn't mean it's going to be.
Do you know why we do it? Why we buy it? Because the old mirror neurons kick in. If Brad and Angelina like this wine, I will not only like it, I will look like them, you know? Yeah. It's the same with nail polish, OPI. Anybody, you know this nail polish? Sex on a beach, oh, I'll wear that. You know? So yes, another question. Yes?
I had a question. Do you find that the new generation is looking more for, I'm thinking about the quote you put that luscious lady, she said,
yes.
I don't want to know how delicious this wine is, I want to know about its cultural significance or its cultural validity. Do you find people are more looking maybe for education in their wine writers now, more about just learning by themselves and recommendations? If you want to try a great Tempranillo from Spain, here are some good suggestions. Or, you know, are they more looking for that instead of scores?
You know what? I would just love it if they would. I have never given a wine score in my life unless I'm judging. Personally, I'm not happy about scores. I remember when Beppe Carrasol, you know, how do you pronounce his last name, was writing for the Globe and Mail. When he first started out, there were no scores. I said yes. Then all of a sudden the scores started to appear. I thought, why? So somebody's demanding these. But I think it's wonderful when you tell the story about the wine, when you say why it is culturally valuable. Well, you know, what's going on here? What can I learn from this? So I don't have evidence that that is the case, but I will certainly welcome it if it is. Yes. Question?
I just want to make a comment about a point that you included, that as you gain more education or more experience with various wines, the wine writer becomes more of an expert, and presumably they move away from the average consumer preference. But I would think likewise for the consumer, as they read more wine blogs or experience and taste more wines, they also sort of move away from perhaps the average consumer's preference because they too gain more experience. So I guess I saw there's this sort of co-evolution of wine preference and wine taste and knowledge for both the consumer and the expert, and that over time, certain experts that you may have loved or wine writers that you may have loved may no longer fit your taste preferences, or maybe you've discovered that some of the wines you previously liked may not be your favorite wines anymore. So I thought it was interesting that it's not just it's not a static preference or a static experience to be constantly reading different wine writers. You're constantly evolving who you may read or follow or like to view for your own wine preferences.
That's a beautiful comment. And yes, it does describe. I remember the first course I ever took in geology. Before that, every little lump in the ground was a lump in the ground. But after I took that course, I started to see different layers of strata. I started to see different soils. I started to see brand new things that I had never seen before. And I'd like to think the same is true of wine education. That the more you learn, the more you start to discover, oh my goodness, this is what they're talking about when they talk about length. Holy mackerel, I can still taste it. Let me go back and taste this wine again. And then you start to see new things, and you evolve, and that's the fun of it. It's it's just a way to enhance our lives and give pleasure, and grow at the same time. Yes.
I would just like to add to your question that you asked and the comment that the young lady made. It was brought up earlier. I work for a local wine tour company, and yes, the whole focus is in moving more and more towards having an educational experience. And it isn't just the focus, we're going to go and drink and let's go to the next place. That seems to have been busy in the past. And it's really exciting when you meet with young people who come whether it's a staggered group of people or a mixed company, that come with a very good base of wine knowledge, what their experiences are, what they like, food combinations, what they're looking for, and they're forever looking for and seeking more information, and looking to appreciate Niagara's style of wines, and learning about vintages and everything that you've touched on. It is out there, it's happening.
Yeah, I agree. My grandson is 21, he's 21, and his girlfriend is 21, and they have asked me to do a wine tasting for them and their friends. How great is that? I do. I think it's wonderful. So yes, and it wasn't that way when I don't want to include you in my generation, but when I was younger at all, beer was fine. Occasionally gin. Yes.
I've got a question from Rick, who's joining us online today. He's wondering, similar to Meg, I guess, is there any way or an easy way for a consumer to tell if an expert really has qualifications other than doing their own research into the person's background? He supposes he is asking, how do we filter out the noise?
Yeah. That's a very good question. Well, as I said, I think one way is to. Did you all hear the question? Yeah. One way is to check out the Greek gentleman's 10 top blogs. He's done the background. He knows what's working according to those 4 different properties. So that would be one, and I know them all, and they're fantastic. They're fantastic blogs. They're thorough, they're thoughtfully written, and they're credible and reliable. Another is to check out the wine blogs, the wine blog awards. That was very similar to Meg's question, so I don't know if I should repeat some of the information. And I guess just to say, when you go to a retail store and say, who was your favorite blog? Who do you go to for advice? Friends and family, I guess, friends and trusted advisors, but then you go to the trusted advisor and say, who do you read? Linda Bramble. In a month. He's not here for me to ask him, did I answer your question? See if you can ask him. I love this.
I think unfortunately what you're saying is there's no level of certification. They don't have.
No. Where if you're if you are a soil expert, you have some kind of background, you graduated from such and such a school. But as wine writers, no. You can judge if they've taken certification courses and so on, but again, sometimes that's not a measure.
Yes, you did very well.
Oh, good, yay! Okay, good. One last question? Oh, one last question.
Come on, Steve.
Okay, well, how about quickly, just the role of negative reviews and negative wine reviews, because traditional wine writers will never post a negative wine review. It's just not something that's done. You're talking about the things that you've come across that you enjoy and you want to share that. But online and non-traditional wine writers, it's very much a big part of the blogs and the new stuff, is to have these negative reviews, which people are used to for other cinemas and whatever
Yeah.
else that you're looking to. I
Yeah.
want to make a comment on that.
Yeah. That's always a toughie, but it's certainly a responsibility of any good wine writer. It just depends on how they handle it. And I mentioned earlier that there are blistering reviews that are unfounded. I think there are ways to say this wine is not a good one, especially if you give it an 82, if you're prone to give marks and so on. You can describe with faint praise. I think it is a responsibility to let people know what's good and what isn't. What might you stay away from? What do you think?
I think it's a very hard line, because you also then, it does impact upon your relation with the industry as well. And that has a lot to going back to your credentials and whatnot, because you do as a writer have to have good relations with the industry, but not too good relations with the industry, right? And that is a hard balance.
That's right. It's so true. I know I when I do write about wines, I only write about the ones I like. So there it is then. Anyway, thank you everybody. You were just wonderful. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. But I have a little gift for you. I don't know what's in it, but it doesn't go swish, swish.
Oh, it doesn't?
So we can't have it later. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and those online. I would be remiss to not mention next week's performance by a Covey Fellow, Michael Ripmeister from Geography Department here at Brock University, and the topic title is Wine as Heritage Across Niagara. Sounds interesting, so we'll all have to reconvene, and we'll see you all next week. And again, thank you, Linda. That
Pleasure,
was
Barb.
wonderful.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time.